Hi guys, Nathan here. Welcome back to Nathan's Online Academy. Today we will be touching upon the subject of the 7 deadly sins, 七大宗罪. Most of you are probably pretty familiar with what these 7 deadly sins are. Pride, wrath, lust, gluttony, envy, greed, and sloth. 傲慢、嫉妒、愤怒、怠惰、贪婪、暴食跟色欲，这是大家广为熟知的7大宗罪。What I would like to do today is to shed a bit of light on the historical origins of these 7 deadly sins. Humanity has not been without its faults and errors throughout the course of history, but the concept of the 7 deadly sins is particularly enticing, as it is the first attempt of the actual categorization of sins. Now, the concept of categorizing sins into a hierarchy first originated in the 4th century, quite a long time ago, with an individual called Evagrius Ponticus, who was a Christian monk. What is quite interesting is in the original categorization of sins, there were actually 8, not 7. The 8 souls or evil thoughts that, Ponticus believed that plagued the human soul were as such: gluttony, lust, avarice, sadness, anger, acedia, which means apathy in a spiritual sense, 也就是灵性上的无感, vainglory, and pride. Vainglory 呢，其实也就是自负心的意思. Ponticus asserted that these 8 sins, after his thorough categorization, presented themselves as obstacles to achieving spiritual enlightenment and ultimate communion with God himself. Afterwards, Evagrius Ponticus's disciple, John Cassius, brought the specific framework of the 8 categories of sin to the Western Church in his works, the Institutes. Ultimately, in the 6th century, Pope Gregory I refined this list, consolidating this list and reordering them into the 7 deadly sins that we are now so familiar with. The way that Pope Gregory I ordered these sins was in accordance to their, spiritual gravity, as he so himself deemed to be as such. And now, this list of the 7 deadly sins, passed on through millennia through the Christian doctrine, has become quite the foundational influence in numerous works that reflect Christian faith, spirituality, or theology. Well, as we mentioned earlier, Pope Gregory I organized these 7 sins to reflect their spiritual gravity. In simpler terms, they were formed in a hierarchy to reflect their severity. One can view these sins sort of like a set or racked up set of dominoes. By pushing one of the root causes, one of the root sins, the other sins will descend and cascade over in order, further corrupting the individual and leading to the further exacerbation of, moral failings. For each of these 7 individual sins, the Church also paired one virtue for each to reflect on how the worshippers or how the believers could actually rectify themselves, or preventing themselves from straying too far from the light. The first one is pride, the root of all sin. Now, its corresponding virtue is humility, which is quite self-explanatory. The second sin is envy. The corresponding virtue, kindness. Third one is wrath. Corresponding virtue, patience. Fourth one is sloth. Corresponding virtue, diligence. The 5th one is greed, in its opposition, generosity. The 6th one is gluttony, and in opposition, temperance. And the final and ultimate sin is lust, and on its opposite side, chastity. Well, now, if you believe that you fall under the category of one particular vice, you can actually attempt to actively pursue one of the corresponding virtues and view it as a path to salvation, or if not to that extent, just a remedy for the vice that you have. So let's say, for example, you are a lustful individual, then maybe attempt chastity for an extended amount of time. If you are a wrathful person, then according to the list, a path towards salvation is to actively pursue patience. And once again, just a very quick reminder, these 7 sins are stratified as such, is greatly dependent upon what Pope Gregory I deemed to be in accordance with severity. Well, alas, in modern standards, I believe that all of these 7 sins are quite equal to one another, and it is quite possible that one does not lead to the other. But, that is my own personal view, and it is not my goal nor my intent to directly refute the beliefs of Christianity. Now, what I would like to do here is to provide a list of synonyms and related adjectives that are closely associated with the 7 sins themselves. But let's start with the first one, pride, also known as superbia in Latin. Well, most people already know what pride is. Oh man, it just means arrogance, which is basically how Lucifer fell from the grace of God and became Satan himself, as according to John Milton's Paradise Lost, or many of the biblical works. 那我们现在就来介绍一下跟 pride 相关的几个常用的形容词，希望这些大家都没有听过，所以可以来学到一些新的单字。First one is arrogant. I think this one is quite common. That means you're self-conceited, overly self-confident. And if you don't know what conceited means, conceited just means having an excessively high opinion of yourself. So it's actually quite a good word when wishing to describe a person who has excessive pride. Another word would be one that I had just mentioned earlier, which is vainglorious. Vainglorious. Vainglorious describes when a person is overly confident, boastful, or full of vanity. This also leads to the concept of hubris. Hubris is a Greek word that describes being overly confident or having excessive pride about oneself. So hubris is one of the main factors that causes the downfall of numerous heroes in Greek mythology. Now, another word that I quite like when describing someone who falls under the category of the sin pride is pretentious. Pretentious. Pretentious means that you're attempting to feign importance, well, greater importance than the level that you actually possess. So that's being pretentious or being snobbish. Snobbish. Snobbish means being condescending. Condescending and snobbish both mean that you look at others as an inferior when in actuality they are not. Now, to throw one final word in, the adjective haughty. Haughty. Haughty means scornfully superior or disdainful. When you treat someone with disdain or treat someone with haughtiness, it means you already assume that you don't like someone and that they don't actually deserve your respect or your interest. All of these are great adjectives that are closely associated with the first and root sin, superbia, pride. Moving on to the second sin, envy, invidia. Envy is one of the main causes of conflict and strife, also evident in biblical works. Take Cain and Abel, for example. The first murder to happen was due to the sin envy. This particular sin fosters resentment and discord, undermining bonds that are either communal, social, or even familial. So now moving on to some of the adjectives that can be used when we want to describe someone who has envy, invidia, as a prominent sin. We'll skip jealous and spiteful, so I'll just briefly mention them because these are common adjectives that I believe most of you guys already know. So the next one we'll be talking about is covetous. Covetous. Covetous means that you covet something. To covet something is to desire something that is not yours and should not be yours. Another interesting adjective related to invidia, envy, is resentful. Resentful. When you resent someone, you feel a particular sense of bitterness that stems from the concept of injustice or perceived injustice, most of the time the latter, perceived injustice, but not in actuality. So when you are resentful of someone, it means you resent them because you think that you have been done dirty. Another adjective that just came into mind was petty. P-E-T-T-Y, petty. I think most of you might have heard of this one as well. It's quite a common adjective that is thrown around all of the time. Petty means that you are envious in a trivial and small-minded way. For example, when someone asks you for a small, simple favor and you refuse to grant it to them just because of a small grudge that had happened earlier between both of you, that means you are a petty person. You have acted out of pettiness. Another common word I can think of right now is discontented. We all know that contentment is a synonym for satisfaction. Discontented means that you are dissatisfied and envious of others. So these are the adjectives that are closely related to the second sin, envy, invidia. Moving on to the third sin, wrath, ira, 愤怒. Now, according to cautioning in the Bible, wrath causes estrangement and escalated violence when left unchecked. Now, the main point that the Bible wishes to convey is that wrath is not only socially corrosive, as it estranges individuals within a community, but also corrodes away at the spirit, so it is also spiritually corrosive. As for the Latin word ira, I think most of you might have heard of this before, dies ira, the wrath of God. Let's talk about some of the adjectives associated with ira. The first one is wrathful, which is self-explanatory. That means having a lot of wrath, easily angered. Another one is irate, which means intensely angry and easily enraged, which is also another good adjective when using to describe a person with wrath. Enraged. Enraged just means having a lot of anger. Let's move on to some of the fancier words. Tempestuous. Tempestuous. Tempestuous means that you are emotionally turbulent and prone to outbursts, fits of anger. The word tempestuous actually comes from the noun tempest, which is a violent storm, 暴风. So it means that you are basically like the storm itself, a destructive force that cannot be reckoned with. The next fancy term is belligerent. Belligerent. Belligerent means that you are combative and warlike in attitude, behavior, and mentality. The etymology of the word belligerent comes from a Latin root, belli, which means war. For example, words like bellicose, or Latin terms like jus ad bellum or casus belli. These are all closely associated to war. Jus ad bellum means 正义战争，在进行战争或武装冲突有正当的理由，理由的正当性叫做 jus ad bellum。那至于刚刚讲的那个 casus belli 呢，其实就是 act of war， 也就是战争理由、战争原因的意思。Another word that comes to mind as of now is vindictive. Vindictive means seeking revenge, vengeance, or spiteful retaliation. It means you really want to get back at someone because you're so angry at what has been done or what has been done to you specifically. The next sin, sloth, acedia, 怠惰. Most people seem to have a predisposed concept of what sloth entails, but it's not actually just laziness. The original meaning of sloth, acedia, is spiritual despair, spiritual apathy. Laziness or indolence is the broader interpretation on a more comprehensive and societal level. So just keep in mind that 怠惰 sloth is not just referring to people who are lazy and refuse to move. Now what is interesting is that the word sloth used as a noun refers to a specific kind of animal that lives in rainforests, 树懒. So you probably can take a guess at why that animal was named sloth. Let's talk about some of the adjectives. The first one is slothful, which is, well, again, requires no explanation. Next one is indolent, which means that you don't show any real effort or interest in something, you are lazy, unmotivated. This is also closely associated with another adjective called lethargic. But lethargic is not actually the same thing as being lazy, but it means that you are acting in a way that shows that there is a lot of lethargy in your system. And lethargy here, well, just describes the feeling of having little energy or no real motivation to accomplish or to achieve something. Apathetic means that you lack any genuine concern, interest, or even enthusiasm about anything in the world or all things around you. So if you are apathetic towards something, it means you are quite indifferent, cold, not caring about these things. Another one that hits quite close to home is the adjective complacent. Noun, complacency. Complacent means that you are quite self-satisfied and unmotivated to improve or to further any progress that you could currently be pursuing. So being complacent means that you probably know you should be doing something else, but you're not. You are satisfied with the status quo and you are unmotivated to progress further. That is being complacent. One final adjective is spiritless. The reason I mention this is because it's much closely related to spiritual apathy and despair. Spiritless means that you are without spirit. Now, spirit here is talking about the energy and the drive or motivation that one possesses when in attempt to pursue a goal. Basically, in simple terms, spiritless means that you lack enthusiasm or drive. These are all adjectives that can be aptly substituted when attempting to describe someone who possesses the sin, acedia, sloth. The next sin, greed, avaritia, 贪婪. Greed is not just for material possessions or money. Greed is the overwhelming desire for power and riches. The reason that it is greatly condemned is because of its potential capacity to dehumanize and exploit others in the pursuit for furthering wealth or power. The first adjective is avaricious. Avaricious means being in a state of avarice, which basically means being excessively desirous of wealth or gain. You wish to gain a lot more than you probably need or should have. Another adjective, materialistic, which I think describes a high percentage of the current population these days. Most people chase after materialistic possessions, designer handbags, designer clothes, more expensive stuff. So if you are materialistic, it means you are obsessed with material possessions and wealth in a negative way. Another adjective is hoarding. The verb is hoard, which we did talk about before in one of our posts, I believe, about dragons. Hoarding means you accumulate excessive wealth, material possessions, and are quite reluctant to share or part with such possessions. If you are a person who does this, then you are a hoarder. Another adjective that rolls off the tongue is rapacious. Rapacious means aggressively, excessively greedy, or grasping. Another adjective is insatiable. Insatiable means unable to be satiated. The word satiate as a verb means to satisfy yourself in terms of a specific need, such as pleasure, food, and such, so that you would not desire to have any more. If you are insatiable, that means you are unable to be satiated. You will always crave, you will always covet more stuff, more possessions. Moving on to sin number 6, gluttony, gula, 暴食. Now, despite the Chinese translation, it is not solely confined to the meaning of consuming or ingesting food. Gluttony symbolizes the overall lack of restraint and warns against all sorts of overindulgence that might clash or hinder one's path of spiritual pursuit. Let's jump right into the adjectives. The first one is gluttonous. Gluttonous. Gluttonous means that you are a person of gluttony. You like to gorge yourself in stuff, especially food. Another adjective closely related is overindulgent. Overindulgent. That means you indulge too much. When you are overindulgent, it means you consume excessively, especially in an unrestrained manner. Which means that the adjective unrestrained is also quite a good word to talk about too. Unrestrained means that you are not restrained, you are not kept in check. You are like a horse, a wild mustang without the reins to pull you back. The next adjective is voracious. I wouldn't actually classify this one as a negative word itself, but it could have certain negative connotations. The word voracious means having an insatiable appetite, which could also be used for people who are especially hungry, famished in some sort of sense. Closely related to voracious is ravenous. Ravenous means that you are extremely hungry and eager to consume food. Two other interesting words closely related to animals are wolfish and piggish. Wolfish and piggish, even though they are quite different animals, one is a predator, another one is prey, but when used in the form of adjectives, they both describe the same thing, as being eating or consuming in a gluttonous manner, to pig out or to wolf something down. So these two animals are, when used as adjectives or used in phrases, are most oftenly referring to people who are overly gluttonous or feeding in a ravenous sort of way. Another adjective which is quite archaic, but you could still use it, is esurient. Esurient. Esurient just means you are hungry and greedy, an esurient individual. Well, most of the times you are not really required to use less common or fancier language, but well, sometimes in different occasions when you use this sort of language, you do come off as slightly more cultured in some sort of sense. Now this is the pride, the superbia in me speaking. The final sin, the seventh sin, is lust. Luxuria, 色欲. The focal point of luxuria is the obsession of physical desire over spiritual and emotional integrity, which in the eyes of Christianity represents a deviation from the path of divine purpose. In the modern age, I think this is one of the most commonplace sins. Let's talk about some of the adjectives commonly used when describing someone who suffers from luxuria. The first one is lascivious. Lascivious. Lascivious means that you are driven by an overt desire, specifically sexual desire. The desire of physical flesh. Another adjective that starts with L is lecherous. Lecherous. A lecherous person is an individual who is overly indulgent in sexual pursuits. In this case, we call this person a lecher. Another word that starts with L is licentious. Licentious. Licentious means you are morally unrestrained in sexual conduct, which is quite an accurate description of this status quo of polyamory. One more adjective that starts with L. Libidinous. Libidinous. Libidinous comes from the noun libido. Libido is sexual desire, and libidinous just means that you are filled with lustful and sexual desires. And another L, lustful, which is also quite apt at describing a person who is lascivious, licentious, and lecherous. We're going to skip some of the easier ones like impure, carnal, sensual. Now, another one that has come to my mind is prurient. Prurient. Prurient is used to describe a person who has an excessive interest in sexual matters. This is specifically used when one person is interested in another person's sexual behaviors. Sort of like a voyeur. Going down into some of the words that start with D, debauched, debauched, or depraved, depraved. Debauched and depraved both mean that you indulge in sexual excess. And one more, salacious, salacious. Salacious means, well, arousing or expressing inappropriate sexual interest. I don't really know why, but when speaking of luxuria, well, a slew of adjectives immediately come to mind, well, much more compared to the other 6 sins mentioned earlier. It might just be me though.